just 2 days after our wedding, my mother-in-law fired our live-in housekeeper. She looked right at her and yelled, "Martha, you're fired! From now on, my daughter-in-law will be the maid around here." I immediately packed my things and walked straight out the door to my mother's house. The very next morning, 2 federal law enforcement cruisers pulled up to their suburban estate and arrested her entire family. On the morning of my second day of marriage, I hadn't even gotten used to the feeling of being someone's wife yet. That was when a shrill scream came from the kitchen, sharp as a razor blade, piercing right through my eardrums. I had just changed out of my wedding dress, which still smelled of expensive perfume, and put on comfortable, casual clothes with every intention of heading downstairs to help out. That was when I clearly heard every single word my mother-in-law said. "Martha, you are let go. From this moment on, my daughter-in-law is here. Why should we keep paying outside help?" I froze halfway down the grand staircase. The sensation at that moment was surreal, like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water from the top of my head down to my feet. Just yesterday, there had been nothing but sweet words and holding hands in front of all the relatives. Phrases like, "This family now has a new daughter," had flown freely. But in just one night, the tone changed completely. There was no warmth left, let alone the voice of a mother speaking to her new daughter-in-law. I slowly walked down the steps and saw Martha clutching her worn canvas tote bag, backed into a corner of the kitchen. Her face was pale and her eyes were puffy, as if she had been subjected to a lengthy scolding. At the dining room table, my mother-in-law, Regina Sterling, brutally tossed a kitchen apron onto the wood surface and lifted her chin in my direction. Her attitude was exactly that of a corporate boss issuing orders to a brand new hire. She spoke right in front of my father-in-law, my husband, and my sister-in-law. "This household does not support daughters-in-law who only serve as decorative trophies. A woman who marries into wealth needs to know how to serve her husband's family." Before I could even open my mouth, she began assigning me daily chores as if she had meticulously planned the entire schedule from the very beginning. She rattled off tasks for every hour with a flat, icy tone. "Starting tomorrow, you are up at 5 in the morning. You prepare breakfast and deep clean the house. In the afternoon, you do the laundry and iron the clothes. In the evening, you cook dinner for the entire family." This estate hosts a lot of guests, so if you turn out to be an incompetent housewife, don't blame me when I correct you. When she finished speaking, she smiled cynically. Her lips curled with bitterness. A girl from a decent background should be hardworking, not sitting around waiting to be waited on hand and foot. What made my entire body go cold wasn't just my mother-in-law's abrasive attitude, but the reaction of my husband, Brad. He was sitting right next to me. Yet from beginning to end, he did not defend me for a single second. I looked at my husband, hoping he would at least say something rational, but he only avoided my gaze and offered evasive excuses. "Mom speaks a little loudly, Chloe, but her intentions are good. She just wants you to adapt quickly to the household routine." That single sentence was enough to make my heart sink to the floor. I no longer felt that this was a momentary explosion of anger. No, this was a meticulously crafted script. They had simply been waiting for the exact right moment. When the country club reception ended, when the guests went home, when I officially stepped into that house as a daughter-in-law, only then did they rip off all their masks. I took a deep breath and asked slowly, pronouncing every word with crystal clarity. "So, in this house, am I your daughter-in-law, or am I the unpaid replacement for your housekeeper?" Hearing this, my mother-in-law flashed a terrifying grin, a smile that sent shivers straight down my spine. She placed her hands on her hips, measured me from head to toe, and answered matter-of-factly, "What is the difference? A good daughter-in-law should know how to work harder and better than hired help. We already provide you with food, shelter, and the social status of belonging to a prestigious Lake Forest family. What more could you possibly want?" The entire living room fell dead silent for several seconds, not out of shock, but because everyone present knew that her statement had crossed every line of basic respect. But the truly disturbing part was that no one there felt the slightest need to intervene. My father-in-law, Robert Sterling, sipped his black coffee with an expression as cold as ice. Brad stared down at his iPhone, pretending not to hear, while his sister, Rachel, stood right next to her mother with crossed arms, smirking. "Oh, come on, Chloe, don't be so dramatic. Our whole family operates this way. We don't believe in treating a newlywed bride like royalty just because she put on a ring." I looked at her self-satisfied face and suddenly realized that I was being tested. They wanted to see the exact limits of my patience, to see just how low I would bow my head. They wanted to break my spirit on the second day, so that I would never be able to stand up for myself again. My mother-in-law stepped forward, snatched the apron off the table, and shoved it hard against my chest. The movement was so aggressive that the zipper lining of the fabric scratched the skin on my hand. She enunciated every word like a stabbing blade. In just a little while, 12 relatives from your father-in-law's side of the family are coming over for a backyard barbecue to eat and meet the new bride. Do your job properly. Do not embarrass this family. I looked down at the apron in my hands. It wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was an instrument of humiliation. It was the stamp they wanted to brand me with, transforming me from a professional newlywed into a free domestic servant for their entire clan. I set the apron back down on the dining table slowly, but with undeniable firmness. Then, I turned on my heel and walked straight back toward the master bedroom. Behind me, I heard my mother-in-law screaming, "Hey, where do you think you're going?" I didn't answer. I opened the closet, grabbed the small carry-on suitcase I hadn't even had time to unpack after the wedding night, and neatly packed a few changes of clothes, my leather wallet, my smartphone, and my charging cables. I unclipped my diamond wedding earrings and placed them carefully inside my purse. Every movement I made was deliberate and unhurried, but my heart had already turned freezing cold. When I walked back down to the main foyer with my suitcase in tow, everyone stared at me. Brad finally panicked. He jumped up from his chair and tried to block my path. "Chloe, what on earth are you doing? If there's an issue, let's just sit down and talk about it." But the grip on my wrist wasn't the touch of a loving husband afraid his wife was hurting. It was the vice grip of a man terrified of losing face in front of his arrogant family. I pulled my hand out of his grasp, looked him straight in the eyes, and said flatly, "If this household requires a live-in maid, I apologize, but I never submitted my resume for the position." Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law flew into a blind rage and pointed a trembling finger straight toward the front door. Her voice was deafening. "If you dare take a single step outside this house today, don't ever expect to come back. Our family does not need an insolent brat who dares to defy her mother-in-law after just 48 hours of marriage." I looked back, facing her furious countenance without breaking eye contact for a millisecond. Perhaps it was the first time in her privileged life that she had encountered someone who refused to cower before her. I replied slowly, driving each word home like a steel nail being hammered into wood. "If this was about being a respected daughter-in-law, I would have considered staying. But as for being the unpaid servant to a family like yours, absolutely not." When I finished speaking, I grabbed my suitcase handle and walked straight out the door. Behind me, I could hear my mother-in-law's vicious insults, my sister-in-law's mocking laughter, and Brad's voice calling my name with sheer irritation. But I didn't look back once. I knew that if I hesitated or glanced over my shoulder, they would assume I was bluffing, and I could not afford to lose this first crucial battle for my dignity. The following morning, while my husband's wealthy family was still boiling with rage, convinced that I was just an ungrateful rebel throwing a temper tantrum, 2 federal law enforcement cruisers pulled up right in front of their wrought iron driveway gates. I was standing right there on the sidewalk next to Martha and a federal supervisory agent. As soon as the front door opened and the federal search warrant was read aloud, I watched my mother-in-law's face drain of all color, turning as white as paper while her lips trembled silently. Only then did it finally dawn on her that the woman she had casually fired the day before wasn't just a simple housekeeper, and that I hadn't walked out of her house because I was weak or having an emotional meltdown. I left that house because I already knew far too much. Seeing the black law enforcement SUVs parked on the manicured lawn of my in-laws' estate, seeing Regina's pale face, and catching the sheer panic in Brad's eyes triggered a vivid flood of memories from the months leading up to this moment. They say that only when the mask is ripped away do we clearly remember every tiny historical detail, realizing that the warning signs were flashing bright red the entire time. Standing there in the chilly morning breeze, I remembered the very first day I met Brad Sterling, and how I had opened my heart and entered this marriage with complete, genuine sincerity. My name is Chloe Miller. I work as a compliance specialist in the corporate legal department of a major consumer logistics and distribution firm in downtown Chicago. My family isn't wealthy, nor do we possess elite political connections. But growing up in a modest neighborhood on the city's northwest side, my single mother always taught me one fundamental truth: live honestly. Never let anyone point a finger at your character and claim you lack integrity. Perhaps because of that upbringing, I have a very direct personality. When something is right, I stand by it. When something seems shady or wrong, I refuse to compromise. I always believed that as long as we worked hard and lived truthfully, life might not be glamorous, but it would be peaceful and secure. I met Brad during a corporate contract negotiation between our supply chain networks. My initial impression of him was exceptionally positive. He spoke with measured calm, dressed impeccably in tailored suits, and never boasted about his family's wealth or country club memberships, the way so many corporate executives do. During our tense contract meetings, he didn't interrupt or try to assert male dominance. Instead, he offered reassuring words to my team. Whatever clauses Chloe's legal team needs to review, please feel free to take your time. Long-term corporate partnerships need to be completely transparent from day one. That single professional courtesy won my respect. After that meeting, he took the initiative to contact me directly, initially just asking clarifying questions about compliance paperwork. Over time, those inquiries transitioned into polite, well-timed text messages that never felt overwhelming. I am not the type of woman who swoons over empty romantic flattery, but I have to admit, Brad was a master at making people feel secure and valued. He wasn't pushy, and he didn't make grandiose promises about our future. He simply showed up consistently at the right moments. When I worked late nights at the downtown office, he would drop by with artisanal coffee. When I was overwhelmed with corporate audits and skipped dinner, he sent thoughtful messages. Let me know when you wrap up. I'll bring you a warm meal so you don't burn out. Slowly, I let my guard down. The more we interacted, the more I felt he was exactly the kind of supportive partner a career-driven woman like me could rely on. Brad frequently said things that validated my ambitions. Once, over dinner, he looked into my eyes and said, I don't need a traditional housewife who spends all day cooking gourmet meals. I just want an honest, educated equal who has integrity and treats her partner with respect. A man who says that is undeniably easy to fall in love with. When our relationship turned serious, he drove me out to the North Shore to meet his family. That was the day I was first introduced to Regina Sterling. If you judged her solely by her polished exterior, no one would ever suspect she was the kind of woman who would later shove a soiled kitchen apron into my chin. She wore designer apparel, and her smile and speaking voice were impeccably manicured. As soon as I walked into the foyer, she took both my hands and guided me to sit beside her on the custom velvet sofa. Make yourself right at home, sweetie. My only wish is to see Brad happy. Aside from that, our household doesn't believe in rigid rules. The gentle way she smiled, the hospitality she showed while serving refreshments, and even the comment she made to her husband, look at our future daughter-in-law, Robert. She has such a composed, intelligent aura, made me truly believe I had hit the jackpot with my future in-laws. My father-in-law, Robert, was much quieter. He wasn't overly gregarious, but he wasn't openly rude either. He simply observed me with calculating eyes. Occasionally, he would ask detailed questions about my legal career and my family background. His intense gaze made me feel like I was undergoing a quiet background check. But at the time, I brushed it off as normal paternal protectiveness. That house already employed Martha, the live-in housekeeper who had been with the family for years. My impression of her was of a slender, exhausted woman who moved through the rooms with extreme caution. Whenever Regina called out her name, Martha seemed to physically flinch. I noticed the fear in her posture, but assumed that after years of service in an elite household, she was simply intimidated by wealthy employers. I had no idea that her downward gaze wasn't born of shyness, but of terror because she had witnessed secrets she dared not speak aloud. After several weekend dinners, my future mother-in-law began subtly suggesting that Brad and I live with them at the estate immediately following the wedding. She framed it so delicately that it sounded completely logical. You two will be newlyweds. If you buy a condo downtown right away, this big house will feel so empty. Stay with us for the first year so the house feels lively while you get accustomed to married life. You can always buy your own suburban place later. Brad enthusiastically backed up his mother's idea. He took my hand and said softly, My mom comes across as formal, but once you live under the same roof, you'll see she has a heart of gold. Besides, when you come home tired from the corporate office, dinner will already be served. It'll take so much stress off our shoulders. Persuaded by their united front, I agreed. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the Sterling family threw lavish engagement parties. Regina would proudly introduce me to her affluent country club friends. My daughter-in-law has a brilliant university degree and works in corporate compliance. She comes from such a respectable, ethical family. Hearing that praise made outsiders tell me I was the luckiest woman in Chicago. I even started to believe it myself. But looking back now with clear vision, there was something deeply disturbing lurking beneath the surface. As the wedding day drew closer, whenever the dinner conversation touched upon my specific daily legal duties, the posture of all three Sterlings shifted subtly. Robert would ask with intense curiosity, "What kind of liability waivers do you typically handle, Chloe? Do you analyze regulatory distribution contracts? Are you fully licensed to certify state compliance filings?" Regina would casually chime in while pouring wine. "A smart girl like you must read through thick, boring legal jargon in minutes, right?" And Brad would add with a lighthearted chuckle, "Once we're officially married, our family's corporate paperwork will be in safe hands." At the time, I simply laughed it off, assuming they were genuinely interested in my corporate career. I never imagined that their intense fascination with my legal credentials was the foundational pillar of a trap they had designed for me before Brad even proposed. I walked down the aisle with simple, pure faith. I believed I had married a wonderful man and gained entrance into a family that, despite their wealth and quirks, genuinely welcomed me. I believed that as long as I showed loyalty and respect, I would be treated as an equal. Because I trusted them so completely, when that shiny coat of decorative varnish finally peeled away, the shock was immense. I realized that behind the grand facade wasn't just a flawed family, but a structure entirely rotted from the foundation up. The events of that second morning weren't a sudden, unprovoked shift in mood. They were the calculated climax of numerous warning signs that had been systematically tested along the way, toxic little jabs that make my blood run cold in hindsight. During our engagement, I constantly gaslit myself into thinking I was just being paranoid. But a woman's gut instinct rarely lies. After spending more time at the estate, I began noticing Regina's conversational tactics. She never fought openly or through vulgar insults. Instead, she wrapped her poison in passive-aggressive jokes, waiting to see if I would swallow the bait. Once, during a formal dinner with extended family, she looked across the table at me and laughed brightly. "A modern career woman with degrees like Chloe probably doesn't even know how to wash lettuce or boil a pot of pasta properly. Do you, dear?" The entire table chuckled politely as if it were harmless banter. I forced a polite smile, but my stomach tightened. On another occasion, when I mentioned my exciting plans to aim for a senior compliance director promotion after the wedding, Regina sliced through the conversation while peeling an apple. At the end of the day, a woman's true value is judged by the warmth of her home and kitchen, not by her corporate job title. The atmosphere in the room chilled instantly. The remark wasn't shouted, but it was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at my professional independence. Before I could respond, Brad reached under the tablecloth, squeezed my knee, and laughed easily. "Mom's just old-fashioned, Chloe. Don't take it to heart." His habitual pattern of smoothing over his mother's disrespect rather than setting boundaries forced me to swallow my discomfort repeatedly. Brad's sister, Rachel, had a much blunter approach. If her mother preferred thinly veiled sarcasm, Rachel favored direct hostility. She would look at my professional business suits with disdain and drop toxic remarks. "Working 60 hours a week downtown? Who's going to actually take care of my brother when he wants a family?" Another evening, she stated to the room, "Women who stay addicted to the corporate ladder after putting on a wedding ring usually end up divorced within 3 years." I maintained my composure out of politeness, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. I wasn't even legally married yet, and the mother-daughter duo was already coordinating attacks against my career, my independence, and my identity. The more time I spent in that massive house, the heavier the air felt. They constantly preached about elite etiquette and manners, yet the person who suffered the most under their roof was Martha, the loyal housekeeper. She walked through the halls like a ghost, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floors, moving as if breathing too loudly might trigger physical violence. One afternoon, I watched Martha serve espresso in the sunroom. Because her hands shook slightly and she spilled a drop on the saucer, Regina snarled with venomous rage. "We don't pay top dollar to harbor clumsy, useless help in this house." Martha bowed her head deeply, her chin trembling as she hurriedly wiped the saucer and apologized repeatedly. Watching that scene made me physically sick. Truly respectable, cultured people do not treat their employees like subhuman garbage. Then came an incident that permanently set me on edge. One weekend, I walked past Robert's home office on the ground floor. The heavy mahogany door was cracked open just an inch. I glanced inside and saw stacks of corrugated shipping boxes, industrial heat sealing machines, and crates overflowing with generic, unlabeled plastic bottles of dietary supplements and pharmaceutical capsules. Before I could process what I was looking at, Robert suddenly materialized inside the doorway and slammed the heavy door shut, pulling the handle tight. He shot me a venomous, suspicious glare that lasted several seconds before forcing a fake, tight smile to his face. Just standard supply chain logistics, Chloe. Nothing a bride needs to concern herself with. His hyper-defensive reaction left me deeply suspicious. But the most chilling warning came directly from Martha. Late one evening, as I walked from the outdoor patio toward the kitchen, I crossed paths with her in a dimly lit hallway. Her eyes remained glued to the floorboards, but as she brushed past me, she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. Miss Chloe, do not sign a single document in this house without reading every microscopic line. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned to ask her what she meant, but she had already vanished into the laundry room like a shadow. That warning sent a cold shiver down my spine. Do not sign anything. Why would a terrified, quiet housekeeper risk her safety to issue such a specific warning to me? Just days before the wedding ceremony, my suspicions reached a boiling point. Regina called me into the formal living room and dropped a thick manila folder of legal documents into my lap, claiming they were just standard marital insurance riders and municipal asset registration forms that needed signature processing before our honeymoon. She spoke rapidly, creating a false sense of urgency, insisting she was too overwhelmed with catering logistics to explain them. I opened the folder. With one glance at the preamble clauses, my corporate legal training kicked in. These weren't standard civil insurance forms. The corporate entity names were obscure commercial LLCs, and the liability assumption language was exceptionally broad and dangerous. I calmly closed the folder, smiled brightly, and handed it straight back to her. I'll take these home to review carefully with my legal notes over the weekend, Regina. Sound good? I still vividly remember the exact look on her face. The sweet smile evaporated instantly. It lasted for only a fraction of a second, but I saw it clearly. It wasn't the disappointment of a busy mother. It was the sharp, frustrated rage of a con artist whose easy mark had just dodged the trap. She quickly recovered her composure and laughed stiffly. Of course, dear. Always good to be thorough. That very night, I accidentally overheard Regina whispering to Brad at the far end of the upstairs hallway. Her tone was sharp and agitated. This girl works in corporate compliance, Brad. She's not a pushover. We are going to have to wait until she's fully settled in and completely trusts us. I froze in the shadows. Before I could catch another word, they fell silent, sensing someone approaching. When I stepped into the light, Brad immediately walked over, wrapped his arms around me, and kissed my forehead as if nothing had happened, blaming his mother's tense mood on wedding planning stress. I smiled back at him, but an unshakable dread settled deep in my chest. They didn't want a beloved daughter-in-law. They wanted a controllable asset, someone obedient, naive, and willing to sign whatever paper was pushed across the desk without asking questions. Everything I had vaguely suspected before the wedding became undeniable reality immediately after the vows were exchanged. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was completely cast aside. The reception at the country club had barely ended, and the final guests were still waiting for valet parking. When I walked into the private bridal suite and found Regina sitting at the table, aggressively tearing open all our wedding envelopes. She was stacking cash, counting $100 bills, organizing diamond jewelry boxes, and declaring with total authority, I'll keep all the monetary gifts safely deposited in my accounts. Young couples with too much cash on hand always make terrible financial decisions. Before I could express my shock, Brad nodded firmly. Good idea, Mom. You secure the funds, and we'll discuss allocation later. That single word later felt like a steel trap snapping shut. The monetary gifts from my relatives and friends belonged to us. If there was a discussion to be had, it needed to happen transparently, not through a unilateral confiscation. I stared at the piles of envelopes and my mother-in-law's greedy hands, and my gut twisted. But wishing to avoid a public screaming match while guests were downstairs, I held my tongue. I realize now that this was her first major test to gauge my submission level. That night should have been our private wedding night, but at nearly 11 o'clock, a sharp knock rattled our bedroom door. It was Regina. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute, commanding authority. Set your alarm early tomorrow morning, Chloe. We still have out-of-town guests staying in the guest wings. You need to be downstairs in the kitchen by dawn to help prepare breakfast. A respectable new bride doesn't sleep in late, or people will assume your mother raised you without basic manners. Even on my wedding night, she couldn't resist laying down oppressive, degrading rules. The next morning, day one of marriage, I dragged myself out of bed at dawn and went straight to the kitchen to help Martha. Before I could even pour myself a cup of coffee, Regina appeared at my shoulder, pointing at countertops and scrutinizing my every move like a prison guard waiting for a violation. When I sliced the breakfast fruit slightly too thick, she clicked her tongue in disgust. When I filled a coffee mug half an inch too close to the rim, she sneered. We spent a fortune marrying our son to a proper wife, not bringing a pampered princess into this house to be served. Her words made my face burn with anger, not because of the manual labor, but because of the intentional, calculated humiliation in front of the household staff. And the part that cut deepest? Brad witnessed the entire routine. He strolled into the kitchen, poured his juice, heard his mother's venomous jabs, and didn't utter a single syllable in my defense. At one point, he leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Just bear with it for a few days, Chloe. Keep Mom happy." I stared into his eyes and felt a chilling void. A husband who truly loves his partner protects her dignity. Brad actively chose to be a complicit bystander. Around noon that day, Robert called me into his formal ground-floor office. He sat behind his massive desk with a thick stack of corporate legal binders spread out before him. "Take a quick look at these filings, Chloe," he said smoothly. "They're just internal compliance affidavits for our distribution logistics. Sign and stamp them on the dotted lines so we can expedite processing. Since you're a licensed compliance officer, keeping these filings in-house saves us massive legal retainer fees." I picked up the top binder. After reading only 3 pages, my professional instincts screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. These weren't routine logistics affidavits. They were indemnification filings and regulatory compliance guarantees tied to high-risk shell corporations distributing unverified chemical commodities. I set the binder down immediately, keeping my voice level and calm. "Robert, I cannot legally sign or stamp corporate compliance filings without conducting a thorough due diligence review of the underlying inventory, let alone sign them as a personal favor." The instant the words left my mouth, the room's atmosphere turned poisonous. Robert slammed his coffee mug onto the mahogany desk with a violent thud. Regina stepped out from the shadows of the bookshelf, her face twisted in a cynical sneer. "You've been a member of this family for less than 24 hours, and you're already treating your own father-in-law like a criminal?" I knew right then that I had touched upon an illicit core they would never allow anyone to challenge. By nightfall of day 1, the hostility escalated into violence. While walking past the side courtyard, I heard a muffled commotion near the detached storage garage. Peering into the darkness, I saw Regina physically grabbing Martha by the arm, roughly shoving her toward the garage door. "What exactly have you been whispering to Chloe behind my back?" Regina hissed. Martha was shaking from head to toe, unable to speak. Robert stood a few feet away with his hands in his pockets, watching the intimidation without moving a muscle. I stepped out onto the gravel path and called out, "Is everything all right out here, Regina?" Instantly, her posture transformed. She released Martha's arm, smoothed down her sweater, and smiled sweetly. "Everything is fine, dear." Martha was just being clumsy and knocked over some garden supplies. But even in the dim security lighting, I could clearly see the angry red marks blossoming on Martha's forearm. That was no accident. That household was harboring a massive, illegal secret, and Martha was terrified of what she knew. Later that evening, when I went upstairs and opened my leather designer tote bag, my breath caught in my throat. The interior zipper pocket was pulled to the opposite side from where I habitually leave it. My personal folders and identification documents were slightly out of order. I am meticulous with my personal effects. I know instantly when someone has riffled through my belongings. When I looked up, Brad was standing in the bedroom doorway watching me. "I thought you might need your phone charger, so I was looking for it earlier," he said quickly. The excuse was painfully clumsy. I didn't push the issue, but inside my mind, every piece of the puzzle finally clicked together. The suspicious corporate binders, the violent interrogation of Martha, the unauthorized search of my leather purse, everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. They didn't just want an obedient wife. They desperately needed complete control over my legal identity. I had walked into that estate wearing a white gown and carrying heartfelt trust. Within 24 hours, I found myself trapped in a claustrophobic, paranoid compound dripping with deceit, surveillance, and a desperate fear that I would uncover the truth. Yet even then, I couldn't have predicted that the absolute worst was waiting to explode on the morning of my second day. I woke up on the morning of day 2 while it was still pitch black outside. Downstairs, I could already hear the clattering of heavy pots and pans. Today was the day Brad's extended family members were scheduled to arrive for a lavish barbecue to inspect the new bride. Anyone who has married into wealth knows this is never a simple party. It is a hostile audit. They don't just come to eat. They evaluate your posture, your speech, and your willingness to submit to the family hierarchy. I walked down the grand staircase into the heavy scent of roasting meats. In the kitchen, Martha was already sweating over massive industrial stoves, looking completely exhausted from being dragged out of bed at 3 in the morning. Regina paced back and forth across the granite islands, glancing toward the staircase as if waiting for her audience to assemble. She wasn't acting like a hostess preparing a meal. She was staging a public execution. Before I could even say good morning, Regina barked, "Martha, get out here right now!" Her voice was so shrill and aggressive that Brad, Robert, and Rachel immediately looked up from the breakfast table. Martha flinched violently, wiped her wet hands on her apron, and scurried into the dining room. Without a word of warning, Regina pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from her blazer pocket, slammed them onto the dining table, and said coldly, "Here is your severance pay for the month. You are fired. Pack your bags and leave." As of today, this household no longer employs outside help. Martha stood frozen in absolute terror. My heart pounded against my ribs. But before I could process the cruelty of the moment, Regina turned her head, looked me dead in the eye with a smirk of pure disdain, and purposely raised her voice so the entire family could hear every syllable. "My new daughter-in-law is young, healthy, and capable. A proper family maintains its own household. Why should we waste tens of thousands of dollars a year paying strangers when we have her?" Her words dropped into the center of the formal dining room like a live grenade. This wasn't subtle manipulation anymore. It was public, deliberate degradation, a declaration that from this second forward, I was stripped of my professional status and demoted to an unpaid domestic servant. I turned my eyes to Brad. That was the absolute last moment I held out a shred of hope that he would act like a husband. All it would have taken was one sentence. "Mom, stop it. That's completely inappropriate to prove that I hadn't married a monster." But he just sat there in his cushioned chair, his face expressionless, his fingers laced tightly together on the table. After an agonizing silence, he spoke in a flat, detached voice. "You should probably take some time off from your corporate job anyway, Chloe. The office can wait. Helping Mom run the estate is our priority right now." Hearing those words froze the blood in my veins. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't Regina's solo project. This entire nightmare had been co-authored by my husband. They didn't just want to trap me in a kitchen. They were deliberately trying to sever my connection to my corporate law career, my financial independence, and my professional support system. They wanted to isolate me inside this gated compound until my spirit broke, ensuring that whenever they placed a fraudulent corporate document in front of me, I would sign it without hesitation. I stared straight into my mother-in-law's eyes and asked slowly, "Why did you decide to fire Martha specifically this morning, Regina?" Regina let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh. "Because this estate doesn't need 2 maids." She pointed a sharp finger directly at my face. "You have 2 choices right now, little girl. Number 1, you learn your place and start serving this family. Number 2, you grab your suitcases and get the hell off my property." That single sentence obliterated the final remnants of my patience. I stood completely still in the center of the room, looking at the wealthy, corrupt family surrounding me. And in that exact moment of tense silence, while everyone's attention was fixed squarely on my face, Martha bent down toward the floor. She pretended to pick up a dropped linen napkin right beside my carry-on suitcase. As she stood up, her hand moved with lightning speed, slipping a small, rigid black object into the side exterior pocket of my luggage. Before anyone could see, she barely moved her lips and whispered into the air, "Miss Chloe, leave now. Do not stay here. Everything they are terrified of is on that drive." I froze for a fraction of a second, but that was all my analytical mind needed. The entire horrific puzzle snapped into crystal-clear focus. The violent interrogation in the courtyard, the fraudulent indemnification paperwork, the unauthorized search of my purse, Robert's murderous glare at the storage room, and Brad's calculated silence. Firing Martha this morning had nothing to do with saving money on housekeeper wages. They were forcibly removing an eyewitness who knew too much and simultaneously stripping me of my career so they could use my clean legal credentials and bar license to turn me into their corporate fall guy. Because I stayed silent for several seconds, Regina mistakenly assumed I was cowed. She shouted louder, "Your mother clearly failed to teach you basic respect. That's why you barge into a wealthy family and don't know how to bow your head. I can endure personal insults directed at me." But the moment she dragged my hard-working, honest mother into her filthy mouth, a line was crossed. Nobody has the right to degrade the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me, just because I refused to become a wealthy family's slave. I reached out, grabbed my carry-on suitcase, and dragged it forcefully to the center of the marble dining room floor. The wheels screeched loudly against the polished stone. I reached up, slid the diamond wedding band off my finger, and slammed it down onto the glass dining table right in front of Brad. The sound of the platinum ring striking the glass rang out like a gunshot, instantly silencing the room. I looked Regina in the eye, and then shifted my gaze to Brad. A daughter-in-law deserves respect. A professional housekeeper deserves fair wages. You people want to humiliate me and enslave workers without paying a dime. I am not your maid, and I am not your corporate patsy. The entire family sat frozen in shock. Not a single one of them anticipated that a newlywed bride would possess the spine to talk back to them with such absolute authority. Regina gasped, her face twisting in fury. You dare speak to me like that? I completely ignored her. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and walked straight toward the heavy mahogany front doors. Brad finally jumped up from the table not to apologize, but to grab my arm with a desperate, threatening grip. If you walk out that door right now, Chloe, you are going to cause a massive, public scandal. I looked at the man I had vowed to love just 48 hours ago. 2 days ago, I genuinely believed he was my safe harbor. Looking into his panicked eyes now, all I saw was the cold, calculating rage of a criminal whose corporate human shield was slipping through his fingers. I yanked my arm out of his grip and said coldly, No, Brad. The massive scandal is the criminal enterprise operating inside this estate, and you aren't going to be able to hide it much longer. I turned my back on him, pushed open the grand front doors, and marched down the driveway without looking back once. When I arrived at my mother's modest home on the northwest side of Chicago, I immediately locked myself inside my old bedroom. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline, but my mind was operating with razor-sharp precision. I unzipped the side pocket of my suitcase and pulled out what Martha had slipped inside. A compact, high-capacity black USB flash drive. I booted up my laptop, plugged the USB drive into the port, and sat frozen in front of the glowing screen. The drive was loaded with gigabytes of explosive evidence. There were undercover video clips showing workers in the estate's detached garage repackaging expired, toxic industrial chemicals into generic dietary supplement capsules. There were high-resolution scans of off-the-books accounting ledgers tracking millions of dollars in illicit cash flows. There were forged safety compliance certificates bearing Robert Sterling's signature, and most horrifying of all, numerous corporate shell company agreements where all criminal and civil liability was systematically transferred to a third-party corporate compliance officer, with the signature line left blank, waiting for my name. As I opened file after file, a profound, icy dread washed over me. I hadn't been paranoid. This entire marriage, from Brad's initial approach at the supply chain meeting to the lavish country club wedding, was a premeditated operation. I sat back in my chair and let out a dry, bitter laugh that burned my throat. 48 hours ago, I was wearing a white veil, believing I was building a future founded on love. Now, staring at the blank signatory lines on federal distribution contracts, I realized the exact space they had reserved for me in their family, the defendant's chair in a federal courtroom. I didn't break down crying, and I didn't rush back to Lake Forest to scream at them like a hysterical victim. When my mother knocked softly on the bedroom door, looking worried sick, I just looked up calmly and said, Mom, I need to call Uncle Frank. My mother's younger brother, Frank, is a veteran supervisory special agent with the FBI, specializing in white-collar financial crimes and corporate fraud task forces in the Chicago field office. I knew that if I called him while crying or sounding emotional, he might initially treat it as a domestic marital dispute. So when he answered his secure phone line, I kept my voice completely level and professional. Uncle Frank, I'm not calling you for family advice. I am sitting on a massive cache of federal corporate fraud and product tampering evidence. I need your guidance to initiate a formal federal whistleblower protocol immediately. The line went dead silent for several seconds. I heard him exhale sharply, and then his voice dropped an octave into his commanding, professional tone. If you are certain about what you're looking at, Chloe, do not make a sound or alert anyone. Keep your laptop open and securely encrypt and transmit screenshots of the primary directory files to my official terminal right now. That instruction confirmed he recognized the gravity of the situation. Less than an hour later, an unmarked black federal SUV pulled up in front of my mother's house. Uncle Frank walked inside wearing a dark windbreaker, carrying a secure leather briefcase. his face set in stone. He didn't ask how Brad had treated me, or why my marriage had imploded in 2 days. He pulled up a wooden dining chair right next to me, put on his reading glasses, and said quietly, "Open them file by file. Let's see what we have." For the next 2 hours, the two of us methodically examined every spreadsheet, every shipping manifest, every bank routing number, and every video clip. As we traced the digital footprint, Uncle Frank's jaw tightened. When I opened the high-resolution scan of the primary corporate indemnification contract, the one with the corporate liability officer signature block left blank, he tapped his index finger hard against the laptop screen. Twice. He looked at me with intense gravity. "Did Robert or Brad hand you these exact documents to sign yesterday?" I nodded slowly. Uncle Frank's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. "If you had signed your legal name and affixed your corporate compliance credentials to this document, Chloe, you would be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary when the FDA and FBI raided that warehouse." His words felt like a sledgehammer striking my chest. I stared at the glowing screen with a bone-dry throat. They didn't want a daughter-in-law. They specifically hunted down a clean, licensed corporate attorney to act as their disposable shield against federal prosecution. Uncle Frank sat in complete silence for a long moment, processing the evidentiary chain. Finally, he closed his notebook and spoke with absolute authority. "Listen to me very carefully. From this exact second forward, you do not contact any member of the Sterling family out of emotional anger. Do not threaten them, do not provoke them, and under no circumstances let them know you possess this USB drive. But surviving a high-stakes corporate criminal conspiracy rarely goes according to a neat schedule. Just before midnight, my smartphone began vibrating violently on the nightstand. It was Regina calling, then Rachel, then Brad, then the estate's landline. The calls came flooding in like an avalanche, frantic and desperate, exposing the sheer panic gripping their household. I watched the screen light up repeatedly in the dark bedroom, my heart turning to ice. Innocent people do not launch a midnight telephone blitz. I let every single call go to voicemail. After 30 consecutive missed calls, I typed out a brief, cryptic text message and hit send. "Stop calling my phone. I already know everything." Less than 5 minutes after the delivery receipt pinged, Brad called again. I stared at his name glowing on the glass display. There was no love left inside me, only an urgent, analytical need to hear how far he would go now that his mask had completely disintegrated. I answered the call without saying a word. Brad's voice came through the speaker, stripped of all charming pretense, sounding harsh and terrified. "What kind of insane game are you playing, Chloe? What is on that USB drive you stole from Martha?" I let out a soft, cynical laugh. His absolute first concern wasn't my well-being or our marriage. It was the stolen digital data. I answered with chilling calm. "You should probably ask your mother what she's more terrified of right now, Brad. Me, or a federal grand jury subpoena." Dead silence fell over the line. I could clearly hear his heavy, panicked breathing and the sound of his teeth grinding together. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped into a venomous, threatening hiss. "Do not cross this line, Chloe. You have no idea who you are dealing with, or what my family is capable of destroying." I leaned back against my wooden headboard, keeping my eyes fixed on the laptop screen displaying his family's forged bank records. My voice remained remarkably steady. "I already know enough to realize I will never be your family's unpaid maid, and I know more than enough to ensure I will never be your federal fall guy." Brad hesitated, his breathing ragged. Then he snarled a final, desperate ultimatum. "If you hand that drive over to the authorities, there is no turning back for you. We will ruin your life." I smiled coldly into the dark room. "The people who have no turning back aren't sitting in this bedroom, Brad." And I hung up the phone. Sitting across from me at the kitchen table, Uncle Frank didn't offer superficial comfort. He simply stated the brutal reality. "From this moment forward, erase any emotional concept that Brad Sterling is your husband. He is a primary target in an ongoing federal corporate conspiracy investigation. Treat him solely as a hostile asset." Swallowing those words caused physical pain, not because I still pined for Brad, but because mourning the murder of your own innocence hurts deeply. Recognizing that the man you pledged your life to viewed you as nothing more than a legal human shield permanently destroys your capacity for naive trust. Early the next morning, I escorted Uncle Frank directly into the secure federal building in downtown Chicago to submit my formal whistleblower declaration under penalty of perjury. I didn't act like a heartbroken bride throwing a tantrum. I sat in the formal debriefing room, opened my briefcase, and turned over the original black USB drive, walking federal forensic accountants through the metadata, directory trees, modification timestamps, and corporate structures. The senior federal prosecutor examined the evidentiary chain for hours, asking precise legal questions before formally docketing the criminal complaint. As the official seals were stamped onto the intake records, I knew the point of no return had been crossed. This was no longer a domestic dispute over housework. It was a major federal criminal investigation. Before we stepped out into the hallway, Uncle Frank placed a firm hand on my shoulder and looked me dead in the eye. "You are no longer an aggrieved spouse in a divorce proceeding, Chloe. You are a federal material witness and a cooperating whistleblower. Check your emotions at the door and keep your guard up." I nodded firmly, but a haunting question echoed in my mind. What was Brad's true operational role in this syndicate? Was he merely a weak, cowardly son bowing to his domineering parents' criminal enterprise, or was he the active architect who manipulated me from day one? Stepping out onto the bustling downtown streets under the clear Chicago sky, my chest felt hollow. I knew the Sterling family wouldn't simply surrender their multi-million-dollar empire without launching a vicious counterattack against the woman who dared challenge them. I initially assumed that filing the federal complaint would force the Sterlings to retreat temporarily, to consult their defense attorneys. I was wrong. Within 24 hours, they pivoted to the dirtiest, most vicious playbook imaginable, launching a coordinated psychological and social smear campaign designed to terrorize me into withdrawing my statements. Later that morning, my mother was standing at her kitchen sink when our landline rang. When she picked up, Regina's shrill, arrogant voice echoed through the earpiece. "You certainly did a phenomenal job raising your daughter, didn't you? Teaching her to extort her husband's family and destroy a marriage after just 48 hours. Regina's tone dripped with the venomous superiority of the ultra-wealthy accustomed to bullying working-class people. But my mother isn't a weak woman. She calmly turned off the kitchen faucet, dried her hands on a dish towel, and replied with icy composure, "My daughter doesn't destroy anyone's life, Mrs. Sterling. She simply refuses to act as an accomplice to corporate felons." Regina choked on her own breath, fell silent for a second, and then unleashed a sinister, mocking laugh. "Let's see just how tough your little family is when the real pressure starts." And she slammed the phone down. My mother turned to me, her eyes steady. "They're starting to show their true teeth, Chloe. Be ready." By late afternoon, Brad materialized on my mother's front porch. He didn't call ahead, nor did he carry himself like a husband seeking reconciliation. Although his expensive suit was pressed, his face was pale. His jaw was tight, and his eyes radiated the panic of a trapped predator desperate to save his own skin. When I stepped out onto the porch, keeping the screen door locked between us, he didn't offer a single word of apology. He went straight to his desperate proposition. "Delete the backup copies of that USB drive, Chloe. Hand over the original hardware, and I swear I will make this entire situation go away. We can walk away clean." I looked at him through the wire mesh. My heart felt completely numb. In that critical moment, my only priority was protecting the integrity of the federal investigation. I stepped 1 inch closer to the screen and asked quietly, "If I had signed those corporate compliance binders yesterday, Brad, and the federal task force raided your warehouse 6 months from now, would you have stood up in that courtroom and taken the prison sentence in my place?" Brad froze completely. The suburban street breeze rustled the oak trees in the front yard, but he didn't shift his weight, nor did he utter a single syllable. His absolute agonizing silence was the clearest, most brutal confession possible. He had never once intended to protect me. From the exact moment he bought me that first cup of coffee downtown, I was designed to be his sacrificial lamb. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the platinum diamond wedding band I had carried away from the dining table, and held it up to the screen. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles knotted in his cheeks. He glared at me and growled, "Do not force my family to destroy your professional reputation, Chloe." I stared right back into his panicked eyes. "The only people who forced anything were you and your parents." He lingered on the porch steps for several seconds, breathing heavily, before turning on his heel and retreating to his luxury sedan. Watching his taillights disappear down the street, any lingering emotional doubt evaporated. He wasn't a conflicted husband. He was a primary co-conspirator attempting to obstruct justice. I thought Brad's porch threat was the lowest they would stoop. But by nightfall, the Sterling family launched an aggressive social media character assassination campaign. A trusted colleague from my corporate compliance office forwarded me dozens of screenshots from industry group chats and social media platforms. My blood ran cold. There were candid photos from our wedding reception posted online alongside fabricated, defamatory narratives. The posts claimed I was a calculating, fraudulent gold digger who had married Brad solely to execute an extortion scheme, and that upon being denied access to his trust funds, I had fabricated insane criminal accusations to blackmail his family. One anonymous industry comment read, "She works in legal compliance. She obviously engineered this entire setup to shake down a wealthy Lake Forest family for millions." My throat constricted. They were deliberately attempting to poison my professional reputation and paint me as a deranged extortionist before the public and the legal community could discover the truth. Less than 10 minutes later, a direct text pinged on my phone from Rachel. "Did you honestly think a nobody from the Northwest Side could take down the Sterling family? You're completely finished in this city. Keep dreaming." I didn't engage with her vitriol. I replied with a single, unshakable sentence. "I'm not fighting your family in the gutter, Rachel. I'm letting the federal justice system handle you." I knew sociopaths thrive on emotional hysteria. I refused to give her the satisfaction. Just past 1 in the morning, Uncle Frank called my encrypted line. His voice was tense and urgent. "The Sterling Syndicate has initiated an aggressive damage control protocol. Now that their intimidation and smear campaigns have failed to silence you, intelligence indicates they are moving to the final stage: systematic evidence destruction and witness elimination. They are shutting down operations. Stay on high alert." A cold dread gripped my chest. I realized the catastrophic danger unfolding across the city. They weren't just attempting to discredit my character. They were moving to silence the one critical eyewitness still trapped inside their gated compound: Martha. At exactly 1:45 a.m., while my mother's house was dark and silent, my cell phone vibrated on the mattress. The caller ID displayed a blocked, unknown number. When I swiped to answer, Martha's terrified, breathless voice echoed through the speaker in a frantic whisper. "Miss Chloe, they locked me in the basement storage wing. They told me if I talked to the authorities." Before she could finish the sentence, a violent, crashing sound echoed through the line, followed by the sickening thud of a heavy object striking wood. The call terminated instantly into dead silence. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. This had officially escalated beyond a corporate financial crime or a toxic family dispute. This was unlawful restraint, kidnapping, and witness tampering orchestrated by desperate felons backed into a corner. I immediately dialed Uncle Frank's secure number. When he picked up, his federal law enforcement training instantly took command over the line. "Did you hear another voice? What was the exact acoustic signature of the crash? Did the disconnect sound like a physical impact or a cellular drop?" I rapidly relayed every acoustic detail of the frantic call. As I narrated the terrifying sounds, Uncle Frank instructed me to immediately plug the USB drive back into my laptop and examine a hidden audio subdirectory we had bypassed earlier during our initial financial audit. I booted up the drive, navigated to the hidden folder, and put on my noise-canceling headphones. There was a compressed audio file stored near the bottom of the directory. When I hit play, Martha's voice filled my ears. But she didn't sound like a timid, uneducated housekeeper. She spoke in a sharp, professional, highly technical tone. "I have successfully cloned the primary distribution shipping logs. The only remaining gaps are the physical warehouse departure manifests and the chemical supplier chain records for the synthetic filler additives. I need to extract these files before Robert relocates the illicit inventory." A deep, authoritative male voice responded over the covert recording device. "Maintain strict operational cover, Martha. Do not compromise your position. Alert the task force the second the chemical inventory is confirmed on site." The 30-second clip ended. I sat frozen in absolute stun. Martha wasn't a desperate civilian housekeeper who had stumbled across shady paperwork. She was an embedded, covert federal informant or a private intelligence investigator working an ongoing FDA, FBI task force operation. I gasped aloud as the pieces connected. I wasn't the only person who had discovered their criminal syndicate. Someone had been operating inside that gated estate for months, patiently documenting forged signatures, financial laundering, and toxic chemical distributions, waiting for the federal trap to close. I remembered the chilling urgency in Martha's voice when she slipped the USB drive into my suitcase. Everything they are terrified of is on that drive. She hadn't just handed me ammunition to save my marriage. She had entrusted me with the critical evidentiary package of a massive federal investigation, risking her own life to protect mine. That very night, Uncle Frank initiated emergency law enforcement protocols, waking federal judges and United States attorneys to convert the pending investigatory files into immediate, no-knock federal search and arrest warrants based on exigent circumstances and active hostage endangerment. But judicial bureaucracy moves at its own methodical pace. A disconnected phone call requires strict corroborating affidavits before a federal tactical team can breach a private estate. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking down on Martha's life. I grabbed my car keys off the dresser. I'm driving out to Lake Forest right now, Uncle Frank. Even if I just park down the street to keep surveillance on the gates. Negative. Uncle Frank barked over the phone, cutting me off with absolute command. You will stay put. If you approach that compound, you will compromise the tactical perimeter and likely end up taken hostage as leverage. Let the federal tactical teams do their job. I stood paralyzed in the hallway. My cell phone buzzed continuously in my palm. It was a barrage of text messages from Brad. Stop interfering, Chloe. This situation is far bigger and more dangerous than you comprehend. If you force federal intervention, no one walks away from this without catastrophic damage. Staring at the glowing screen, I didn't see the arrogant threats of a wealthy corporate executive anymore. I saw the absolute terror of a criminal mastermind watching his intricate structure collapse around his ears. I typed a single response. If it were simple, Brad, your family wouldn't be kidnapping informants to hide it. After that, his phone went dead. The estate had gone dark. At 3:15 inches the morning, Uncle Frank's encrypted phone rang again. He stepped into my mother's kitchen to take the update from the tactical surveillance unit. When he walked back into the hallway, his expression was grim. Aerial night vision surveillance confirms the Sterlings are actively loading cargo trucks from the detached garage at the rear of the estate right now under darkness. They are moving to destroy the chemical inventory. If those trucks breach the perimeter and disappear, our physical evidence chain evaporates, and Martha's USB drive could be contested in court by high-priced defense attorneys as fabricated digital data. I looked into my uncle's tired eyes. Are we going to make it in time? He grabbed his federal badge and tactical jacket. We have to. The atmosphere inside the car charged with high-voltage electricity as we sped north out of the city along the deserted highway. The dark suburban streets blurred past my passenger window, while one solitary thought echoed in my brain. Either this entire criminal nightmare ended tonight, or the Sterling family would slip through the legal system's fingers forever. As our unmarked tactical cruiser turned onto the secluded, wooded street leading to my in-laws' Lake Forest estate, the pre-dawn sky was just beginning to turn a pale gray. The eerie morning mist transformed the sprawling luxury neighborhood into a tense, silent staging ground. Two massive black FBI armored tactical vehicles swung into position directly behind us. Heavy steel doors slid open, and the rhythmic, authoritative sound of tactical boots hitting the asphalt shattered the suburban silence. The Sterling family's grand facade of elite, untouchable wealth was about to be obliterated. Before the motorized wrought iron gates could even swing open, the thunderous voice of the federal supervisory agent boomed through a tactical bullhorn, reading the federal search warrant across the manicured lawns. Lights flickered on inside neighboring mansions as wealthy residents peered out through heavy draperies. In the blink of an eye, the most exclusive block in Lake Forest was transformed into an active federal crime scene. The front doors of the estate burst open, and Regina stepped out onto the marble portico wearing a designer silk robe, her hair disheveled, desperately attempting to maintain her haughty, aristocratic chin. Seeing the dozens of armed federal agents swarming her driveway, she shrieked her standard script. You have breached the wrong estate. This is an illegal violation of privacy. But as her frantic gaze scanned the law enforcement perimeter, her eyes locked onto Uncle Frank's federal badge and then shifted directly over his shoulder to rest on me, standing quietly beside the command vehicle. In a single heartbeat, I watched her arrogant soul evaporate from her body. Her lips twisted in terror, her mouth dropped open, and her eyes bulged as if she were plunging off the edge of a cliff. Robert stumbled out onto the portico directly behind her, still attempting to project icy corporate dominance. He struck the heavy oak doorframe with his fist and shouted at the agents. Federal law enforcement does not enter private property without substantiated evidentiary filings. The lead FBI tactical supervisor didn't lower his weapon or alter his commanding tone. We are executing these federal warrants precisely because the evidence has been substantiated, Mr. Sterling. I watched Robert's rigid corporate posture collapse in real time. For the first time in his privileged existence, the man looked completely, deeply terrified. Federal agents breached the mansion, methodically sweeping the sprawling estate. Within minutes, Tactical teams forced open the heavy reinforced doors, leading to the detached storage annex masquerading as a luxury wine cellar. Pallets of industrial chemical drums were seized. Counterfeit FDA compliance labels were bagged into evidence containers. Hidden safes were breached, revealing off-the-books ledgers and offshore banking tokens. With every sealed evidence box hauled out onto the driveway by forensic technicians, Regina's complexion turned a deeper shade of gray. Rachel charged out onto the front lawn like a hysterical lunatic, her hair wild and her face contorted with fear and rage, spitting her habitual venom. Spotting me near the command vehicle, she screamed at the top of her lungs, "You ruined our family! You parasite! You destroyed the Sterling legacy!" Her theatrical screaming sounded utterly pathetic against the backdrop of federal tactical teams securing criminal evidence. I looked at her with complete emotional detachment and replied quietly, "I didn't destroy your family, Rachel. You did this to yourselves." She lunged forward to physically attack me, but two federal agents immediately secured her wrists in steel cuffs. When corrupt, arrogant people hit rock bottom, they strip away their civilized veneer and attack like wild beasts. While chaos consumed the front driveway, a violent, metallic banging echoed from the far basement window wells of the service wing, someone desperately striking a heavy steel door from the inside. The tactical supervisor signaled his entry team. An agent sprinted down the exterior concrete stairwell. The heavy storage door was secured from the outside with a reinforced industrial padlock. Agents deployed hydraulic breaching tools, shattering the locking mechanism with a deafening crack. The steel door swung wide, and Martha was pulled out into the fresh morning air. Her clothing was torn and soiled, her wrists were bruised from zip ties, and her face was haggard from exhaustion, but her eyes burned with fierce resilience. She shook from adrenaline as federal paramedics rushed to check her vitals. This was no longer just an abstract financial crime or a regulatory violation. Here stood a living human being, physically assaulted and unlawfully restrained to conceal a corporate enterprise. Seeing Martha emerge alive from the basement, Regina's legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed against a wicker patio chair on the porch, trembling uncontrollably as she stammered to the arresting agents. I don't know anything about this. Those chemicals aren't mine." Her pathetic, transparent denials only cemented her guilt. I lifted my gaze from the weeping woman on the porch and looked up toward the second-floor landing of the grand staircase inside the open foyer. Brad stood motionless at the top of the steps. He hadn't uttered a single sound since the federal tactical teams breached the property. There were no more arrogant ultimatums, no more charming smiles, and no more corporate confidence. His gaze locked onto mine, a chaotic swirl of pure rage, paralyzing fear, and the bitter shock of realizing his human shield had defeated him. Looking up at my husband standing in handcuffs, I felt no sorrow. The person who committed the betrayal in this marriage wasn't standing on the driveway. As the federal operation concluded and the entire family was placed under formal arrest, Robert, now wearing steel cuffs around his wrists, turned his head as agents escorted him toward the prisoner transport van. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred and spat. "You think you've won, don't you?" I met his murderous gaze with complete serenity. "No, Robert. I simply refused to lose." He fell silent, stunned by the cold finality of my voice. Perhaps it was the exact moment he realized that his psychological intimidation tactics and his family's corrupt wealth held zero power over me anymore. The federal convoy pulled out of the estate gates as the morning sun rose over Lake Forest. The deep rumble of the armored engines seemed to sweep away the toxic wreckage of the lies they had built their lives upon. I stood quietly on the sidewalk outside the grand estate I had entered as a bride just days ago. The cool morning breeze washed over my face, leaving my mind sharp and clear. Martha was safely transported to the federal field office for debriefing and medical evaluation. The criminal evidence was secured in federal custody. The suffocating psychological pressure was gone. Those who had viewed me as a disposable piece of trash to throw under the federal bus had fallen completely from their pedestals. The public scandal erupting across the city would be massive. But deep down, I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. There was still one critical missing link in the chain of evidence, and just thinking about it sent a cold shiver through my veins. The federal cruisers turned the corner at the end of the wooded lane, and the whispered gossip of the stunned Lake Forest neighbors began to dissipate into the morning air. I climbed into the passenger seat of Uncle Frank's unmarked vehicle, and we drove back toward the city in silence. Throughout the drive, the horrifying image of Martha's bruised wrists and Regina's pale, terrified face played on loop in my mind. But more disturbing than anything else was the haunting memory of Brad standing silently on the second-floor staircase landing. His cold, motionless stare troubled me, not out of lingering romantic grief, but because my analytical instincts warned me that his operational role in this syndicate had not yet been fully exposed. Late that afternoon, Uncle Frank sat down with me at my mother's kitchen table, his face etched with grim exhaustion. I poured 2 cups of coffee and asked directly, "What did forensic accounting uncover during the preliminary hardware interrogation, Uncle Frank?" He sighed deeply and organized his notes. During the initial post-arrest processing, Brad attempted to play the victim. He claimed he was merely a junior corporate employee following his father's directives, completely unaware of the chemical tampering or financial fraud. For a brief, fleeting second, an irrational spark of hope flickered in my chest. Maybe he really was just a weak son manipulated by his father. But that desperate emotional illusion was crushed 5 seconds later. Uncle Frank slid a printed digital forensics summary sheet across the table and tapped his pen against a highlighted section. "Look at the IP routing data and digital signatures associated with the fraudulent shell corporations. The server access logs, the alteration timestamps on the indemnification filings, and the administrative login credentials for the offshore accounts. Every single digital fingerprint traces directly back to Brad's personal workstation and his encrypted corporate email terminal." I stared down at the data sheets. The logical progression, the late-night system modifications, the dual authentication access codes, it was undeniable. It was mathematically impossible to lie to myself any longer. I looked up at my uncle, my voice cracking slightly. That means Brad wasn't just a passive bystander obeying Robert. Uncle Frank nodded grimly. "Brad isn't stupid, Chloe. He didn't scream, throw temper tantrums, or physically assault household staff like his mother and father. He operated in the digital shadows. He engineered the corporate shell networks, drafted the fraudulent indemnification agreements, and specifically designed the legal structures designed to isolate his family from federal prison sentences. People like Brad are the most dangerous sociopaths in the corporate world. They delegate the physical brutality to others while keeping their own hands impeccably clean." Hearing those words turned my blood to ice. The charming, rational mediator, the man who brought me late-night coffee and spoke passionately about corporate ethics, was the primary intellectual architect of a criminal enterprise. As I stared at the federal forensics report, the entire historical timeline of our courtship flashed through my mind with horrifying clarity. His calculated refusal to argue with his mother, his smooth, professional persistence in asking me to sign routine legal annexes, his late-night appearance on my porch demanding the hardware under the guise of saving our marriage. Every single action was a meticulously planned step designed to lead me directly to the defendant's table as the designated corporate shield for his family's crimes. I let out a harsh, rasping laugh that sounded like tearing sandpaper. Uncle Frank watched me quietly without interrupting. I stared out the kitchen window. He didn't pursue me because he loved my personality or because we shared common life goals. He targeted me specifically because my state bar credentials, my clean professional compliance record, and my lack of wealthy family backing made me the absolute perfect legal tool. I was custom ordered to serve as his federal insurance policy. Uncle Frank nodded slowly, a solemn confirmation that hurt worse than any spoken sympathy. That very evening, the front doorbell rang. My mother was resting upstairs, exhausted from the stress of the day. I walked to the foyer and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Brad was standing on the front porch steps. He had been released on temporary bail pending his federal arraignment, and he looked like a shadow of his former self. His posture was slumped. His face was drawn and haggard. The collar of his dress shirt was wrinkled, and dark, bruised circles framed his sunken eyes. It took him several seconds to summon the breath to speak, his voice reduced to a hollow rasp. "I never imagined you would actually pull the wire and destroy everything we built, Chloe." I leaned my shoulder against the door frame. Just 3 days ago, seeing him in such emotional and physical distress would have broken my heart. Today, standing before him, I felt an absolute emotional void. There was no humanity left inside me for this man. I looked him dead in the eye and fired back without hesitation. "Did you genuinely believe you would walk away from a multi-million-dollar federal indictment without a scratch, by using my legal credentials as your body armor?" Brad dropped his gaze to the porch floorboards and swallowed hard. The silence stretching between us was dense and suffocating. He offered no moral justification, no desperate denial, and no apology. His silence was the ultimate ratification of his sociopathic design. I took one step forward, standing inches from him, yet feeling light years removed from the man I thought I knew. My voice dropped to a quiet, icy whisper. "You chose your side of the ledger, Brad. And I chose integrity. His right hand twitched at his side, clenching into a weak fist, but no words came out of his mouth. He finally realized the federal trap he had constructed for me had permanently snapped shut around his own neck. Recognizing there was nothing left to salvage, I stepped backward and firmly closed the front door in his face, throwing the heavy deadbolt lock. Through the peephole, I watched him turn around and stumble down the porch steps into the quiet Chicago night, carrying the shattered remains of his theatrical charade into the darkness. I went to bed that night feeling no lingering love, no paralyzing bitterness, and no chaotic rage, only the profound, empowering relief of total clarity. I had escaped a catastrophic corporate trap just before the steel jaws snapped shut, and better yet, I had dismantled the syndicate before they could destroy my life. I mistakenly assumed that after closing the front door on Brad, my heart had fully processed the grief of my fake marriage. But 3 weeks later, when I received a formal federal subpoena to provide sworn testimony at the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, I discovered the true depth of the horror I had escaped. Inside the freezing federal deposition room, with the air conditioning humming loudly overhead, stacks of evidentiary binders lined the center table. Sitting across from me at the far end of the conference room were Regina, Robert, and Rachel Sterling, accompanied by their defense team. Their elite, suburban country club varnish had completely evaporated. Regina sat hunched in her chair, her eyes shooting cold, impotent venom across the table. Robert sat rigid as a statue, gripping his pen to keep from trembling, while Rachel, who had once flaunted designer jewelry and spit verbal poison, sat staring at her lap, nervously chewing her fingernails in sheer terror. When I walked into the room carrying my simple leatherwork briefcase, Regina couldn't control her impulsive rage. She sneered across the table. "You still have the audacity to show your face in the same room with us after what you did?" A month ago, that remark would have caused me emotional pain. Today, I calmly pulled out my chair, sat down, placed my briefcase on the table, crossed my legs, and pointed a steady index finger directly at her face. "The only person in this room who ever displayed audacity was you, Regina, when you smiled in my face while planning to use my professional legal career as a human dumpster for your family's federal felonies." The deposition room fell dead silent. Regina's mouth dropped open in shock. No one had ever confronted her arrogance with such unfiltered, surgical precision, and speaking those words felt incredibly liberating. I looked right past her and addressed the federal prosecutors by their formal titles. The lead assistant United States attorney continued the deposition without missing a beat, laying out the overwhelming evidentiary chain. The clandestine industrial storage annex, the counterfeit FDA labels, the unauthorized immigrant labor exploitation, and the deliberate indemnification gaps structured into the corporate compliance filings. The conspiracy was completely exposed, yet Robert clung desperately to his defense attorney's arguments with the cold arrogance of a cornered executive. "Signatures rule the corporate law world," Robert argued coldly. "If neither my son nor I signed those specific liability waivers, your office has nothing but circumstantial assumptions without a designated corporate compliance officer to charge." His blatant legal audacity pushed me over the edge. I didn't even wait for the federal prosecutor to open the digital exhibits. I reached across the table and tapped the surface. "You specifically structured those corporate documents to pass a ticking legal time bomb into the hands of a newlywed bride on her honeymoon," I stated clearly. "Let's listen to the audio exhibits." The federal technician hit play on the digital recorder. Instantly, Regina's shrill, commanding voice filled the deposition room from the covert kitchen recording. "Just sign the corporate compliance paperwork and stop being so dramatic, Chloe. If any regulatory issues pop up down the road, the family will handle it internally." Robert stopped breathing. Regina slumped forward, burying her face in her hands. Rachel jumped out of her chair, shaking with rage, and screamed across the table, "You Judas! You married my brother just to infiltrate our family. We gave you our name, and you destroyed us." The federal prosecutor slammed his hand down onto the mahogany table. "Control your client right now, counselor, or I will have federal marshals remove her from this building." At that exact moment, the heavy oak door to the witness waiting room opened, and Uncle Frank escorted Martha into the deposition room. I sat up straight, feeling a surge of profound respect. She walked into the room with her head held high, wearing a simple pair of jeans and a clean button-down shirt. Her skin was pale from her ordeal, but her eyes burned with the unshakable courage of someone who had survived hell. Martha sat down at the witness table, looked directly at Robert and Regina, and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that carried across the room. I spent 7 months gathering covert audio recordings, documenting industrial chemical deliveries, and copying off the book's accounting ledgers for the federal task force without missing a single day. Regina leaped out of her chair like a coiled spring, screaming at the top of her lungs, "You ungrateful traitor! We sheltered you under our roof!" Martha didn't flinch or retreat a fraction of an inch. Her voice grew stronger, ringing with absolute moral authority. "I didn't betray anyone, Regina. I risked my life to prevent another innocent child from being rushed to the pediatric intensive care unit because of the toxic, adulterated chemical fillers your family bottled and sold as health supplements." The entire deposition room froze as if struck by lightning. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The words pediatric intensive care unit struck my chest like a physical blow. Up until that exact second, I had genuinely believed the Sterling family syndicate was strictly involved in white-collar financial fraud, regulatory evasion, and customs documentation forgery. The federal prosecutor immediately turned to the court reporter. "Let the record reflect the witness's statement regarding severe bodily injury." The operational reality shifted instantly in my mind. This wasn't merely corporate financial fraud. This was felony distribution of adulterated substances causing severe bodily harm. It was reckless endangerment and potential corporate manslaughter, and they had systematically engineered their paperwork to make me the designated corporate entity legally responsible for those casualties. The federal prosecutor looked directly across the table at me. "Miss Miller, prior to examining the evidence retrieved from the estate, were you ever made aware of severe adverse medical events or hospitalizations directly caused by the unverified chemical ingredients distributed by the Sterling corporate network?" I shook my head slowly, my palms suddenly slick with cold sweat as I gripped the armrests of my wooden chair. If I had signed those corporate indemnification binders on the morning of my wedding, my bar license and my signature would have legally tied me as the regulatory compliance officer responsible for a chemical poisoning operation that put children in hospital beds. The formal deposition continued for agonizing hours, as federal prosecutors locked down every piece of evidence. When the session finally adjourned and the defense team was escorted out, I walked out into the marble corridor and leaned heavily against the tiled wall, struggling to catch my breath. My physical body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The echoing memory of Martha's testimony preventing another innocent child from being rushed to the intensive care unit replayed endlessly in my head. This entire ordeal had never been about domestic housework, difficult in-laws, or wedding gifts. It was about human survival. I heard soft footsteps approaching along the corridor. "Chloe?" I looked up and saw Martha standing beside me. She wasn't looking at me like a timid housekeeper addressing her employer anymore. She looked at me like a fellow survivor who had weathered a war. I took a deep breath of the cool hallway air and asked softly, "Do you have time to grab a cup of coffee, Martha?" We walked out of the federal building and sat down at a quiet corner table in a small downtown coffee shop, far away from the sterile atmosphere of the legal system. Martha wrapped both hands around her warm mug and finally revealed the truth about her background. "I was never a career housekeeper, Chloe. 5 years ago, I worked as an inventory logistics coordinator for a third-party chemical supply contractor tied to the Sterling distribution network. A massive contamination crisis hit one of our dietary supplement runs because someone intentionally substituted industrial-grade chemical fillers to cut manufacturing costs and boost profit margins." She paused, taking a shaky breath. 2 young children suffered catastrophic renal failure and were placed on hospital dialysis. One of them didn't survive. I gripped my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. "The Sterling corporate lawyers buried the investigation," Martha continued, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "They executed airtight non-disclosure agreements, bribed regulatory inspectors, and pinned the criminal blame on a low-level warehouse shift manager who took the fall. But I knew the truth. I traced the financial authorization codes directly back to Robert Sterling's desk. When federal regulators dropped the case due to lack of direct evidence, I approached a specialized federal task force and offered to go undercover inside their Lake Forest estate as domestic help to gather the definitive proof they needed. I listened in absolute awe at her patience and bravery, and while you were gathering that evidence, I walked right into their trap, letting them treat me like a naive fool. When people look down on domestic workers, Chloe, they become arrogant," Martha said, a weary smile touching her lips. "They speak openly about their crimes right in front of you because they view you as a piece of furniture that can't hear or comprehend." When I realized the federal raid was imminent, I formatted the backup USB drive to hand over to my case handler. But when I saw how aggressively they were moving to isolate you and strip away your career on your second day of marriage, I realized you were their next human shield. I couldn't stand by and let them destroy another innocent life. Why did they target me so specifically? I asked, the pain of the betrayal still aching in my chest. Martha looked at me with deep empathy. Initially, Regina just liked the social prestige of having a corporate attorney daughter-in-law to show off at the country club. But when Brad reviewed your specific bar credentials and compliance background, they realized you were the holy grail for their operation. You had the exact legal licensing required to certify their regulatory filings with the FDA, but you lacked the family wealth or political connections to fight back when the federal indictments eventually dropped. You were designed to be their airtight corporate insurance policy. I choked on my coffee as the horrifying reality washed over me. It was a double deception. Brad had seduced my heart while his family meticulously planned to weaponize my legal education to shield themselves from corporate manslaughter charges. I looked across the table and asked the final, agonizing question weighing on my soul. And Brad? What was his exact role in the chemical distributions? Martha set her mug down and met my eyes with absolute solemnity. Brad was the intellectual author of the corporate liability restructuring. Chloe. Robert and Regina were driven by raw, unhinged greed, but Brad was the legal architect who drafted every single indemnification clause designed to transfer criminal culpability away from his parents and directly onto the designated corporate compliance officer, you. He personally managed the encrypted offshore accounts and designed the digital firewalls meant to keep his hands clean during a federal raid. The charming corporate mediator, the man who claimed he wanted an educated equal rather than a kitchen servant, had spent our entire courtship constructing my federal prison cell. You survived a corporate execution, Chloe, Martha said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You are incredibly lucky to be walking free today. I nodded slowly as the pieces settled into place. The thick manila folders Robert pushed across his desk, the abrupt firing of Martha to isolate me, it was all an intricate meat grinder waiting for the turn of my signature. I walked out of that coffee shop into the brisk afternoon air of downtown Chicago with my head held high. My life had crossed paths with the most ruthless, predatory sociopaths in the corporate world, yet I had survived because I possessed the professional integrity and moral courage to say no when they attempted to degrade me into a domestic servant to mask their criminal conspiracy. The final procedural chapter of my brief marriage took place inside the United States Attorney's Office, where I was scheduled for a formal confrontational deposition facing Brad Sterling across a deposition table to finalize the record on his intellectual authorship of the fraud. Walking into that room to face the man who had disguised himself as my loving husband was emotionally wrenching. When federal marshals escorted him into the room, he was wearing standard civilian clothes, but the physical transformation was shocking. He had lost significant weight, his tailored posture was gone, his skin was sallow, and his eyes darted around the room with the frantic, exhausted panic of a cornered animal. Yet beneath his exhaustion, a desperate spark of manipulative control lingered as he tried to construct a defense narrative. I sat down across from him, took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and looked him straight in the eye without a trace of romantic hesitation. Let's skip the emotional theater, Brad. Just answer the facts. The federal prosecutor opened the massive forensic accounting binder between us. We have the administrative IP routing logs verified by the ISP, Mr. Sterling. We have the metadata from your personal laptop showing the creation timestamps on the third-party liability transfer agreements. You personally edited the indemnification clauses that shifted criminal responsibility for the adulterated chemical shipments away from the Sterling Family Trust and onto Miss Miller's professional bar license. Brad stared down at the damning computer printouts and let out a ragged, trembling sigh. I was acting under corporate directives from corporate leadership. My father made the operational decisions. You are lying under oath, Brad, I interrupted, my voice ringing with cold, terrifying authority. As always, you attempt to hide in the shadows and push someone else into the line of fire. The federal prosecutor slid a newly authenticated corporate resolution across the table. Who specifically authored the operational proposal to utilize a newlywed corporate compliance officer as the primary regulatory guarantor for the Lake Forest distribution hub? The ceiling air vent hummed softly in the tense silence of the room. 15 agonizing seconds ticked past before Brad finally lowered his head and whispered the brutal truth that solved the entire mystery of our marriage. I did. The compliance restructuring strategy was entirely my proposal. His confession struck my chest like a physical blow, permanently extinguishing whatever lingering sorrow I felt for our relationship. Through the heavy glass partition separating the deposition room from the holding area, where Robert and Regina were being detained during the proceedings, a muffled, hysterical shriek echoed through the doorframe. It was Regina screaming at the top of her lungs. "Shut your mouth, Brad. Stop confessing. Don't give them anything." Federal marshals immediately silenced the disturbance, leaving the room to Brad's confession. The man who had orchestrated my legal destruction looked up at me with complete emotional collapse, admitting his methodology in a hollow whisper. I built the entire legal strategy around the psychological assumption that once we were married and living under my parents' roof, you would trust me completely. I assumed you would sign the routine compliance filings without conducting independent audits to avoid marital conflict. Hearing those words eradicated any remaining concept of peaceful reconciliation. My fairy tale wedding had been nothing more than a tactical deployment. I was never a cherished partner. I was a bar license number, a clean corporate record, and a targeted human shield trapped in a sociopath's snare. I picked up my leather briefcase and stood up from the deposition table. I looked down at him one last time. "And when you stood at the altar and vowed to cherish and protect me, Brad, what exactly was I to you?" His final answer stripped away the last remaining illusion of our shared humanity, ringing out cold, raw, and absolute in the sterile federal room. "You were a regulatory shield, Chloe. An airtight corporate insurance policy in case the federal task force ever breached our supply chain." I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy oak door. As the latch clicked shut behind me, the entire fabricated illusion of our marriage died right there on the conference table, buried beneath stacks of federal indictments for wire fraud, regulatory forgery, and corporate manslaughter. The domestic horror show was officially over. The federal prosecution moved swiftly through the federal court system, generating sensational headlines across the Chicago media landscape. North Shore elite wealth ring, busted in massive illegal drug and supplement tampering conspiracy. Corporate shell network exposed. In the weeks following the indictments, dozens of victims across the Midwest came forward to file civil litigation, documenting severe medical injuries caused by the adulterated chemical compounds. Watching the evening news coverage in my mother's living room, a cold shiver washed over my skin. If I had caved to Regina's intimidation on that second morning and signed Robert's corporate binders, my face would be broadcast across those television screens right now. I would be sitting in a federal detention facility facing decades in prison, stripped of my law license, branded a corporate felon before the entire country. A month later, while leaving the federal courthouse after signing routine witness affidavits, I paused at the intersection as a Federal Department of Corrections transport van stopped at the red light. Glancing through the reinforced steel mesh of the side window, I saw Regina Sterling sitting handcuffed on the metal bench. Her face was hollow and aged, her designer wardrobe replaced by a standard orange prison jumpsuit. She stared out at the city pedestrians with empty, lifeless eyes until her gaze accidentally locked onto mine standing on the sidewalk. Even through the security glass, her face contorted in bitter rage, her mouth silently mouthing the words against the reinforced mesh. "You ruined us, you miserable BTH." I stood completely still on the pavement, looked directly into her furious eyes, and said softly to myself with absolute serenity, "You tied the noose around your own neck, Regina. You stepped off the platform all by yourself." The traffic light turned green, and the federal transport van accelerated down the avenue, carrying the matriarch of the Sterling family to a federal penitentiary outside the city. Shortly thereafter, Martha was formally transitioned into a federal witness protection and relocation protocol to shield her from residual criminal reprisal. Before departing Chicago, she met me outside the federal building one last time. She pulled me into a fierce, emotional embrace and whispered into my ear with tears streaming down her cheeks, "You were your own guardian angel, Miss Chloe. Your courage didn't just save your own life, you helped deliver justice for families who suffered unspeakable tragedies because of their corporate greed." We both wiped away tears as we parted ways. Later that autumn, on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, Uncle Frank walked out of the federal courthouse beside me after I formally executed my contested divorce decrees. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder and spoke with the quiet wisdom of a veteran investigator. "The truth is a heavy burden, Chloe. It carries an exceptionally high price tag, and you came dangerously close to paying for it with your entire future." I looked down at the signed divorce decree in my hands, clean, sharp signatures severing every legal and financial tie to the Sterling syndicate. Signing those documents was one of the most empowering moments of my life. It legally ratified my survival and restored my absolute independence. The emotional trauma had completely healed, transformed into an unshakable armor of professional and personal integrity that would protect me for the rest of my days. My story serves as a living warning to any woman who feels her instincts screaming inside a relationship that appears perfect on the surface. Never surrender your professional independence, your critical judgment, or your moral compass, just to keep the peace inside a wealthy or prestigious family. Behind the grand estates, the country club memberships, and the designer apparel, some people conceal the most horrifying moral rot imaginable. Sometimes, colleagues at my corporate law office who know the general details of my past look at me with sympathy and ask, "Do you ever regret going through all that trauma after only 48 hours of marriage?" I simply smile at them with the calm, razor-sharp confidence of a woman who knows exactly who she is. Regret it? The only thing I would ever regret is if I had bowed my head, picked up that kitchen apron, and allowed myself to be degraded into a domestic servant just to appease an arrogant family. That would have been a true tragedy. Reclaiming my dignity and walking out that door saved my life, my career, and my honor. Later that evening, inside my mother's warm, comforting kitchen on the northwest side, the setting sun cast a golden glow through the windows. I stood at the sink, washing fresh vegetables for dinner when my mother walked over, gently smoothed my hair back from my forehead, and asked softly, "Does it still hurt sometimes, my brave girl?" I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a clean towel, and smiled at her with genuine, radiant peace. "It stung for a little while, Mom. But time and truth are incredible healers. I'm far too resilient to let them break me." A profound, lasting relief filled the kitchen, sweeping away the final remnants of the Lake Forest nightmare. The black USB drive remained locked securely in a federal evidence vault, a permanent monument to my survival and my refusal to become a corporate victim. Several months later, while driving out to a suburban compliance seminar, my GPS routed me past the secluded, wooded North Shore neighborhood where the Sterling estate stood. I pulled over to the curb and looked across the manicured lawn. The wrought iron gates were locked tight with chains, the formal gardens were overgrown with weeds, and a massive federal asset seizure notice was taped across the grand mahogany front doors. The sprawling mansion stood empty and silent, a hollow, lifeless monument to human greed and arrogance. I put my car into drive, turned my steering wheel back toward the highway, and merged into the vibrant flow of Chicago traffic with absolute certainty in my heart. My true home wasn't a gated estate built on lies. My home was my own integrity, my resilience, and my unshakable character. I had faced the darkest corners of human manipulation and emerged entirely unscathed, ready to live every single day as the strong, honest American woman I was always raised to be.